With the global surge in demand for critical minerals, there is an increased need for transparency within supply chains. For more on this, we are joined by Mark. Mark, thank you so much for your time. So, building on that intro about the transparency that's needed, talk to me about how EITI's transparency mechanisms can help increase that transparency that's much needed, especially when we're in the space of critical minerals and as it relates to Africa.
So our work on global transparency in the extractive sector is in increasing demand to support analysis, data, and to inform policymakers about the opportunities and challenges around the energy transition in Africa and beyond. With global supply chains coming to the forefront so much in the rush to critical minerals, there's a need and a demand for more information about every aspect of the global supply chain. So all the way from the data we generate around who's producing what, where is it exported to, who by, what volumes, are the companies involved doing it in a fair and transparent way? Is there any scope for corruption in the process? Our data helps throw much more light on the process within the hope that we inject more and more transparency into those supply chains to ensure there's fairness and equity in the supplies of critical minerals.
When you think about your multi-stakeholder models, how do we apply them so that the nations from which we get these minerals get that long-term value, and it's just not necessarily mine and extract and leave the communities behind?
The multi-stakeholder approach is integral to the way we work. It means we bring together governments, companies, and civil society, non-governmental organizations together into multi-stakeholder groups in every country where we are present, including the 27 on the African continent. Within that broader constituency, it gives an opportunity for citizens to have a say through their representatives on the multi-stakeholder group. So the idea of creating that mechanism for improved scrutiny generates public debate so that citizens know much better what's in it for them. Are they going to see the benefits from this enormous demand for the minerals that so many countries hold?
Are there practical steps for that?
Yes. So we, in any country, join the EITI. The early stage is creating the multi-stakeholder group. And that's not something that we direct. We support and advise on. So we draw on experience from countries that already have well-functioning groups. So I've just come from a conversation with the Mauritanian multi-stakeholder group, and they're really joined up. So you have industry with government representatives and their civil society group working coherently together. So right now, Chile, we hope, will be our next signatory, and they're just about to finalize the composition of their multi-stakeholder group. But it's generated by the country. The EITI has to follow national priorities, and within each country, each constituency follows its own priorities in appointing members of the multi-stakeholder group. So it's very decentralized and thereby representative.
We're here in Cape Town, South Africa, and you mentioned some of the countries that you went to that are signatories and they have joined the initiative. Yeah. Is South Africa part of that initiative? What are the conversations there, if not?
We very much hope that South Africa will become a member. It could be a leading member of the EITI and demonstrate to the continent and the community of investors what a great place it is to invest in the mining sector. There's huge appetite for South Africa joining the EITI from industry, from civil society and parts of government. So we're in an early conversation with the government about what would be the right timeline and steps to take, because we understand there's huge appetite in South Africa to throw more light on the sector and its potential benefits for South African citizens.
The one thing we always say is that Africa is not a country. It has many countries within that are very different. Yes. Talk to me about the role you play in being able to harmonize some of the conflicting transparency standards that may exist in one country, but not necessarily in another.
So many countries sign up to a range of transparency standards. What differentiates the EITI is we focus on the governance dimensions of reporting, both for countries and for companies. So we have both forms of reporting in the EITI at the national level and very granular reporting on transparency measures. But we're also supporting the process of consolidation of standards by some of the leading organizations responsible for example, for copper and for other metals. to enable that reporting to be more consistent, more joined up, and yet incorporate some of the long-standing measures that we have on governance and transparency.
When you think about EITI's strategy, the 2024 to 2028 strategy, how do you balance your anti-corruption mandate with emerging priorities like climate resilience?
So we are now 20 years plus. Our strategy has evolved. The energy transition has become increasingly important in our work because it shapes both the opportunities available to mineral producers, but some of the challenges also facing countries that may be long-term dependent on fossil fuels. So our work increasingly needs to respond to country context and the needs and situation of individual countries within that. So anti-corruption was very much a starting point for our work 20 years ago and remains important. But we also emphasize how do countries make the most of their resources through what we call domestic revenue mobilization, through taxes and royalties paid by companies, to throw light on how do governments collect and receive that, and how do they spend it, and how do citizens benefit from that spending. A number of governments have measures in place to then share part of that revenue with governments at lower levels, at the subnational level, provinces and below, which brings it closer and closer to citizens so they can see a direct benefit.
What measurable outcomes will define EITI's success in African mining by 2030?
Ultimately, the thing that all ministers talk to us about is how can they attract more investment? So if we can show that some of our work has contributed to increased investment flows, that's positive. Can we also show that there is increased tax, which is transparent and effectively used, would be a second one. Improvement on corruption is much harder to demonstrate, but certainly to have the measures in place whereby, for example, governments can identify the real owners of companies to make sure that they are open and transparent and not controlled by those who've got vested interests. Those would be some of the outcome measures we draw attention to.
Mark, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For more insights, you can go to miningindaba.com.